Let's do A Syrian Love Story, which is a very, very fine documentary by Sean McAllister, filmed over a period of 5 years, a film which perfectly balances its personal and its political struggles. Basically, it goes from 2009 to 2014. At the beginning of it, Sean McAllister is in Syria. He meets Amer, whose wife, Raghda, is in prison for having written a book criticising the Assad regime. He is raising their children on their own, and he wants some publicity to help raise attention for his plight. A couple of years later, protests obviously start to spark, and there is a movement which actually ends up in Raghda being released. But very shortly after that, Sean McAllister himself is arrested, and some of his footage is found by the Syrian security forces, at which point it becomes untenable for them to stay in Syria. So they go to Lebanon, and then they're finally offered sanctuary as political refugees in France. And what starts off as a portrait of a marriage which has been torn apart by imprisonment and by political oppression, and about children being separated from their mother. The family is reunited, but as a result of what's going on, they are forced to be exiled. And then the film starts to be about how the marriage falls apart in exile. Because what happens is that Raghda is desperate to get back to Syria, for which she has an extraordinary love. Amer, meanwhile, just wants her to, he says at one point, why can't you just go back to being an ordinary woman? Why can't you be a mother? And what the film becomes is a portrait of the way in which being in exile, being a refugee, affects people on a personal level. I mean, on the most obvious level, it is a film about a marriage falling apart. But it's actually, I think, very subtly and very cleverly and very movingly about rather more than that, in that what it's doing is looking at a microcosm of an unfolding global catastrophe through the relationships between a family and their... I mean, it's called A Syrian Love Story, and in many ways there are two love stories here. One of them is between the central couple, between Amer and Raghda, and the other is between them and their very different love for Syria. So you see it, on the one hand, it's a fly-on-the-wall documentary. On the other hand, it's a very, very compelling and well-wrought family drama. You can read it as a proto-feminist tract about whether or not her devotion to her country is more than her devotion to her family. You can read it as a port. I mean, it's odd. It won an award at the Sheffield Doc Fest, and which the jury referred to it as having a Bergman-esque quality in terms of its portrayal of a marriage. It benefits enormously from having been filmed with obvious intimacy and very, very close access. I mean, as the marriage starts to fall apart, we are there through Sean McAllister's camera, being witness to some things in which we feel we really shouldn't be watching these arguments. And of course, the other thing the documentary is about is a child's eye view of trauma, a child's eye view of adult trauma, how it is that children who are raised in a situation where they have seen both their parents be variously imprisoned, how this affects them, and also how, when those children are moved from one place to another place, how their identity begins to change, how their ideas begin to change. So what I thought was really impressive about it is it does all of these things. You can read it as a personal, emotional story in which it's very moving. You can read it as a political story about political oppression and exile. You can read it as a story about gender balance, about male roles and female roles. You can read it as a story about children and adults. I thought it was very compassionate, very well made, like a kind of kaleidoscope. The more you look into it, the more you see is in there. It's called A Syrian Love Story, and it opens today.